Right then, okay. Now, the first quote on the handout, the one from the middle way, I read this. It's at the end of a talk by Chimya Rinpoche, and it's not him, it's somebody's notes on what he said in a question and answer session. And when I read this, I thought, what? That does not make sense as a teaching, as some English sentences actually. So what does it say? Doubt arises from fear, and fear comes from the self. But the self has no power. As you begin to recognize that there is no self, it will send you a message in the form of doubt. Fear and doubt exist to protect the self. The self can give you the impression of existing because it sends you fear and doubt. The self really does not exist. Now, this says that something that does not exist sends one doubt. How can something that does not exist do anything? However it got onto the page, it's nonsense, or it's very confusing. And this is in answer to a question about doubt. If I read that and I didn't know much about Buddhism, it would spin my head into a spin of doubt. I'm not blaming anybody. Actually, I didn't want to mention the name of the Lama. I was just going to say Tibetan Lama. And it was notes on a question and answer session, so maybe it got garbled in transmission. Perhaps. Okay. Right. Okay. Now, my raising of the above with the Buddhist Society led to me being invited to give this public lecture. There is a lot of talk amongst various Buddhists of no self, no soul, self with a small s, self with a capital S, denial of self, denial of soul, true self with a capital S, illusory self with a small s. You get students saying things like, the self is made up of the aggregates, which are not self. These ways of talking can clash and cause confusion. So how can the subtleties around the anattā, anatman teaching be best expressed? What is this teaching really about? And how do we avoid talking confusing garbage about it? Because it happens. I've probably been guilty of it myself in the past. At the end of this talk, you might think I still am. Anyway. Right. Is it right to say that Buddhism denies the self? Okay. The anattā teaching can easily be misunderstood and misdescribed. So it's important to see what it is saying. It's often said that Buddhism denies the self. But what might this mean, and is it true? Now, even in English, self can have a variety of meanings, depending on context. And the same goes for the Pali anattā or Sanskrit atman, which both mean self. In the Pali Suttas, or discourses of the Buddha as preserved by the Theravāda school, which are kind of best like we have on actual Buddha's teaching, before it got elaborated and whatever, as well as Chinese parallel texts as well. Right, okay. So in these texts, the term anattā is often used in the everyday sense of oneself, myself, himself, herself, whatever, according to context. For example, when it's recommended that one should not act in a way that would be displeasing if someone else acted in this way towards one, it is said, self ought to be measured against self, i.e. the self of somebody else should be compared to one's own self. Okay. That's just an ordinary everyday use of the word self. No problem at all. What do we have in common? If I wouldn't like that inflicted on me, don't inflict it on another person. Okay. Right. But in the term anattā, that's an, not, or non-atta, self, which is sometimes translated as no self, atta clearly has a different sense than the everyday sense of oneself, yourself. Okay. A clear problem, though, with the statement that Buddhism denies the self is that when the Buddha was directly asked, does self exist, and also does atta not exist, he was silent. He did not agree with either statement. He didn't even say they were wrong, he was just silent. He was asked these questions by Vacchagotta, a wanderer who was always wanting answers to the undetermined questions, such as on the state of an enlightened person after death, on which the Buddha was also silent. The Buddha later explains his silence on self to his attendant monk Ananda. He said, "To have replied self exists would have been to side with what the Buddha called eternalists, those who believed in an eternal self which survives death. I would not have been, quote, in accordance with the knowledge that all dhammas, everything, is anattā." And then he says, to have replied self does not exist would have been to side with what the Buddha called annihilationists, those who see a person as totally destroyed at death. And, quote, it would have been more bewilderment for the bewildered Vacchagotta, for he would have said, it seems that the self I formerly had does not now exist. Okay. So when the Buddha was asked does the self exist or not, silence, and he sees problems if he'd agreed with either of them. Now, this surely implies that there is a sense of atta or self in which it is inappropriate to say that it exists. But there's also a sense in which it's inappropriate to say it does not exist. So there must be different senses of the word self being used here, or there in the background. Now, given that there is an everyday sense of atta as oneself, which picks out a particular stream of interrelated physical and mental processes, and that the Buddha taught rebirth, not the complete annihilation of such a stream at death, then it would be inappropriate to simply say self does not exist, or she does not exist, or I do not exist. But atta in the term anatta has a different sense than the everyday sense. Okay. So what might it mean? So the term anattā, anatman, this is the one that gets translated as not self, non-self, no self, whatever. And here, quote 2 is relevant. Yeah. The fundamental 3 marks of phenomena, according to the Buddha, are that all conditioned ones are impermanent, anicca, and all conditioned ones are dukkha. Come back to that word. And everything is anattā. It is mainly because things are impermanent that they are also dukkha, which I would see as meaning mentally or physically painful, however subtly. Because they are anything conditioned is impermanent and in some sense painful, moreover, they are seen as anattā, which I will translate as non-self, and I'll say why. When something is said to be anattā, the kind of self it is not seen to be is clearly one that would be permanent and free from all pain, however subtle, which means it would be, if it existed, happy, self-secure, independent. While Pali and Sanskrit have no capital letters, in English it's useful to signal this particular kind of independent permanent self with a capital S, so which is a bit difficult to put across in a talk, but capital S self. It is clear, though, that people often slide from one sense of self to another and one sense of atta to another in an often unhelpful and confusing way. Hence, in discussions, the Buddha often asked somebody talking to him what they meant by self, and then he'd look at what they meant by it. Okay. Now, the term anatta is nearly always a noun in the form of a word for self, with a capital S I would say, atta, prefaced by the negative prefix an, which just means not or none. So it means that what is anatta is nothing to do with self in a certain sense. It is not a permanent self. It is not self. Nor is it anything that pertains to or belongs to such a thing as mine, or what contains self or is contained by self. So what is said to be anattā, non-self, is also seen as empty, in the sense of empty of self or what pertains to self. And while anatta is often rendered simply as not self, this translation captures only part of its meaning, as it misses out the aspect of not being anything that pertains to or belongs to a self, which non-self includes. So I think that's the best translation. Non-self with S, the self with a capital S. Now, the important teaching on this was introduced by the Buddha in his second sermon, the Anattā Sutta. Here he explained with respect to each of the 5 khandhas, usually translated as aggregates, although I prefer bundles, of processes that make up body and mind. So with respect to each of these processes that make up body and mind, that if it were truly self, capital S, it would not tend to sickness, and it would be totally controllable at will, which it isn't. Moreover, each khandha or bundle, that is material form, body, feeling, perception, volitional activities and consciousness, each of these is seen as said to be impermanent, dukkha, painful, and of a nature to change. So it's inappropriate to consider any of these processes of body and mind as this is mine, this am I, this is myself. Okay, so that way of looking at them is quite often emphasised. Not me, not mine, not self, don't hold on to them. Now, in the Buddha's day in India, the spiritual quest was largely seen as the search for the identification of and liberating of a person's true self, capital S. Such an entity was postulated as a person's permanent inner nature, the source of true happiness and the autonomous inner controller of a person's actions, inner elements and faculties. So this was a kind of pre-Buddhist idea. It would also need to be in full control of itself. In Brahmanism, kind of early Hinduism, this Atman was seen as a universal self, identical with Brahman, the impersonal source and substance of the universe and beings. While in Jainism, for example, it was seen as an individual life principle or jiva. But the Buddha argued that anything subject to change, anything involved with the disharmony of mental pain, anything not autonomous and totally controllable by its own or an owner's wish, could not be such a perfect true self, or what belonged to it. Moreover, to take anything as being such a self is to lay the basis for much suffering. For whatever one fondly takes as one's permanent essential self, or its secure possession, all actually changes in undesired ways. While the pre-Buddhist Upanishads recognised that many things were not self, they felt that a real, true self could be found. They held that when it was found and known to be identical with Brahman, the basis of everything, this would bring liberation, enlightenment. In the Buddhist suttas, though, literally everything is seen as non-self, even Nirvana. When this is directly known, then liberation, Nirvana, is attained by total non-attachment, letting go, non-clinging. Thus both the Upanishads and the Buddhist suttas see many things as not self, but the suttas apply it, indeed non-self, to everything. The teaching on phenomena as not non-self is not only intended to undermine the Brahmanical or Jain concepts of self, but also much more commonly held conceptions and deep-rooted feelings of I-ness. To feel that however much one changes in life from childhood onwards, some essential part remains constant and unchanged as the real me, is to have belief in a permanent self. To act as if only other people die, and to ignore the inevitability of one's own death, is to act as if one had a permanent self. To relate changing mental phenomena to a substantial self which owns them, as when you say, I am worried, I am happy, I am angry, is to have such a self-concept. To build an identity based on one's bodily appearance, or abilities, or one's sensitivities, or one's ideas and beliefs, actions, or intelligence, or being a professor of Buddhist studies, is to take them as part of an I. We all kind of build our identities in different ways and try and defend it. Okay. Now, next kind of topic related to quote 3. so-called view on personality. The Buddha was aware of the many ways in which people have views which fix on a supposed permanent self-essence, a self, within the changing phenomena of body and mind. In different ways they locate a substantial self, capital S, somewhere in the 5 aggregates, the 5 bundles, regarding any one of them as being self, or as owned by self, it's mine, or as within self, or having self within it, leading to a total of 20 possible views, which all are seen as contributing to suffering. Each of the views is known as a view, literally, a view on the existing group, Sakkaya Ditthi. That is a view on the nature of the existing group, the 5 aggregates, 5 bundles, khandhas. Sakkaya Ditthi is sometimes translated as personality view. This oddly makes it sound like it is wrong wrong view to think that personality exists in any sense, which seems a bit odd. Better is view on personality, or self-identity view, or simply identity view, which I think Bodhi uses as translation now. The non-acceptance of any of these views in the suttas means, for example, that with regard to the material form or body, it is not truly appropriate to say that I am body, or the body is mine, the body is part of myself, or I am in the body. Indeed, it's said that the body does not belong to anyone. It simply arises due to past karma. And its associated mental states do not own it. And there's no owner of the mental states either. They happen, they're processes, they interact. Just as it is inappropriate to say that Buddhism denies there is such a thing as a personality, so I think it's wrong to say that it denies there is such a thing as an individual. We are each individual beings with a particular history and character. One's individual nature is of course influenced and conditioned by other people, life experiences, one's genes, etc. But because we are not independent and do not have a separated, isolated individuality, does not mean that we are not individuals in some sense. Though people do lack any essence of personhood or individuality, and are only unique in the sense of each being a particular mix of universal types of processes. Those who have transcended view on personality are of the first level of sanctity, being Srimentras, it's kind of first level of enlightenment. So it takes a deep spiritual transformation to go beyond this kind of deeply ingrained view, which may be held at either an unconscious as much as a conscious level. The next one, number 4, the I am conceit. Even when specific views regarding a substantial permanent self have been transcended, a subtle kind of conceit, mana, still remains as a vague and non-specific feeling of I-ness with respect to the 5 bundles, khandhas. Conceit, in this sense, is the basic attitude of I am. Deep-rooted self-centeredness or self-importance, which is concerned about how I measure up to others. And it's interesting, there are said to be 3 forms of the I am conceit. I am superior, maybe said in an arrogant or smug way. I am inferior, which might be said in a self-blaming or self-pitying or fawning way. But also, I am equal, which might be said in a complacent way or a competitive way. They're all going on about this one, me. And in fact, the I am conceit, the way I picture it, is as if we're all going round with an arrow pointing to oneself. We all tend to see ourselves as the centre of things in some sense, in a good way or a bad way, it doesn't really matter. Well, this conceit is seen as causing suffering in various ways. It is this I am conceit which can be seen as the sense of self, I think, or even the ego, which leads people to walking around in the way I've suggested. pointing at oneself. It is a reality, this sense of self or ego. It is a reality, but it is based on a misperception. It's based on a mistake. Only an enlightened person has completely gone beyond this mistake, though he or she still uses conventional expressions such as I say, or they say it's mine. This being, quote, merely conforming to popular usage, without any I am conceit. So, I would say that anatta, because everything is anatta already, does not mean egoless, as it's sometimes rendered. The term ego has a range of meanings. In English, the Freudian ego is not the same as the Indian atman or anattā, or permanent self. In more everyday English, ego just means a self-centered sense of being or having an I, which can sometimes feel inflated, sometimes feel deflated. The existence of this sense, this ego, self-centeredness, is not denied in Buddhism, though it is seen as based ultimately on a misperception of reality. It is something to transcend. Okay, what the anatta teaching is about, and here quote 2 is still relevant. While all dhammas are anatta, meaning everything is non-self, clearly implies that there is no permanent self, the word anatta does not itself mean no self, as it's often seemingly translated, or that compound no self is talked around as if it is the meaning of anatta, which is not quite right. So the word anatta does not mean itself there is no self. It simply means that whatever this word is applied to is not a self or what pertains to it. Just so happens it's applied to everything. Moreover, the non-self teaching is not itself a denial of the existence of a permanent self. It's primarily a practical teaching aimed at overcoming of attachment. A philosophical denial of an independent permanent self is just a view, a theory, which may be agreed with or not. Does not necessarily get one to examine all the things that one actually does identify with, consciously or unconsciously, as self or essentially mine. But this examination in a calm, meditative context of things as non-self is what the non-self teaching aims at. It is not so much a conceptual idea as something to be done. Ajahn Thanissaro calls it a strategy. So it's something to be applied to actual experience so that the meditator actually sees this. Everything is non-self. A mere philosophical denial does not encourage this and may actually mean that the person sees no need for it. They just think, oh, there's no self, big deal, perhaps. While the suttas have no place for a metaphysical self, seeing things as non-self is clearly regarded as playing a vital soteriological practice role. The concept of a permanent independent self, capital S, and the associated deep-rooting feeling of I am are being utilised, being used for a spiritual end. The non-self teaching can in fact be seen as a rather brilliant device which uses a deep-seated human aspiration towards selfness, I. So a deep-seated human aspiration which is ultimately illusory to overcome the negative products of such an illusion. Identification, whether conscious or unconscious, with something as what I truly and permanently am, or as inherently mine, is a sort of source of attachment. Such attachment leads to frustration and a sense of loss when what one identifies with changes and becomes other than one desires. And you cannot be immune from the change from all kind of directions. The deep-rooted idea of self, though, is not to be attacked, but used as a measuring rod against which all phenomena should be compared, so as to see them as falling short of the perfections implied in the idea of self. So the Buddha would probably say, it would be nice if we were a self, but actually not so. So this contemplation is to be done through a rigorous experiential examination of phenomena that we do identify with as self, I, mine. As each of these is examined, but is seen to actually be non-self, falling short of the ideal, The intended result is that one should let go of any attachment to such a thing. In doing this, a person finally comes to see everything as non-self, thereby destroying all attachment and attaining nirvana. In this process, it is not necessary to give a philosophical denial of self. The idea would simply wither away, as it is seen that no actual instance of such a thing can be found anywhere. One can then perhaps see the self, capital S, self idea, as fulfilling a role akin to a rocket which boosts a payload into space against the force of gravity, provides the force to drive the mind out of the gravity field of attachment to the bundles or aggregates. Having done so, got the, if you like, the mind into space, so to speak, it then falls away and is burnt up, is itself an empty concept, part of the unsatisfactory khandhas. Everything is not self. So it is not that the Buddha denied the self, but that he saw taking anything as a permanent, independent and pain-free self as unsupportable and also conducive to suffering. More briefly, one can say that he did not accept anything as being a permanent self. Or one can say that he challenged all attempts to build an I identity on anything. No soul. Just as anatta is sometimes translated as no self, sometimes translated as no soul. But while Buddhism does not accept a soul in the sense of an immortal essence of a person, soul in the sense of that which gives life to the body is not denied. The presence of the flux of consciousness plus vitality and heat are said to be what makes a person alive. The English word soul can also mean the moral and emotional part of a person, and in this sense could be seen to correspond to citta, term which covers both mind and heart, in the sense of the centre of emotions. The term soul can also refer to energy and spirit, as found in good art or music that have soul. Forms of such qualities are part of the Buddhist path. So I would say Buddhism does not lack soul. Buddhism has soul, so to speak. What you need to do is cultivate it. Annihilationism is also rooted in a belief in a self. Deluded I-centeredness is seen as shared even by annihilationists, those who say one is completely destroyed at death. In one passage, it says that the attitude I am leads, amongst other things, to the idea I will not be. I will be destroyed at death. Of which materialism is a clear example. Another passage says that the wrong views, there is for me a self, and there is not for me a self, both arise from unsystematic speculation on whether or what one was in the past, whether or what one will be in the future, or thinking as to the present. Now, am I? Now, what am I? That is, preoccupation with I even leads to the idea that I do not exist. Thus, if the Buddha had said self does not exist, when asked about this, he would have been legitimizing such preoccupation. He thus did not see it as a true statement, or even choose to say that self exists is false. He just didn't get into that game, if you like. So the suttas see even annihilationism, which the Buddha equated with denial of a self, as tied up with belief in a self somehow. In one passage, annihilationism is amongst a range of views which all arise due to view on personality, some way of relating self to factors of personality. People of this kind of view are said to have believed in up to 7 selves, the physical body and various kind of mental cells, perhaps seen as psychic centres of some kind. While all such cells were seen as destroyed at death by the annihilationists, they seem to have been regarded as unchanging during life. For the Buddha described the annihilationists as teaching the cutting off of a real or existent being. They saw death as destroying a substantially real being or self. The implication is clearly that an unchanging real being is synonymous with a self, and that it's contradictory to posit such an entity, but then say it can be destroyed. The Buddha saw it as nonsense to say that a genuine self or real being if it existed, could be destroyed. The annihilationist, then, is one who denies that anything of a person exists after death, but who believes in a one-life self, capital S still, typically identifying this with the body. He is still preoccupied with I or self, then. While annihilationists believed in a one-life self, seen by the Buddha as a type of real being, they could also sound like nihilists, denying not only that there is a world beyond death, but also saying that this world does not exist. There may have been different groups of annihilationists, but it's perhaps more likely that annihilationists held that anything which does not last forever does not really exist. This is so the Buddha's criticism that they accepted a real being that's destroyed at death would amount to the accusation that their beliefs were inconsistent. Now that's the kind of ancient annihilationists, whoever they were. Regards modern philosophical materialism, I think that the Buddha would have seen this as, first of all, having too narrow a view of the kind of processes that there are, so as to wrongly reduce consciousness to some mode of matter, and while being right to accept a self in the sense of a changing, conditioned mental construct, and right not to accept an unchanging, unconditioned self, being wrong in denying any kind of mind stream after death, and as tending to support identification with the body as a substantial basis of identity, to be controlled and moulded in the service of ego. Nowadays people get tattooed all over, get nose jobs, etc. Kind of, this body is mine, I'm going to shape it and make it as I want, and building an ego on it, whatever. Unless there's a medical reason. Accepted senses of self in Buddhism. The Buddha accepted many ordinary uses of the word self, but within such a conventional self, which we might call the empirical self, that's the self one can experience. So within the empirical ordinary self, he taught that no permanent, substantial, independent, essential or metaphysical self could be found. This is well explained by an early nun, Vajira, who said that just as the word chariot is used to denote a collection of items in functional relationship, but not any special part of a chariot, so the conventional term a being is properly used to refer to the 5 bundles or aggregates relating together as a kind of working system. None of the bundles or aggregates is a being or a self, in self with a capital S. They are simply conventional labels used to denote the collection of functioning aggregates. The person, that is, a person has no person essence. They're just a system of working processes, mental and physical. Besides atta as simply meaning oneself, related meaning is when it refers to character. One passage says that a monk is said to be a self-knower when he knows of himself that his spiritual qualities such as faith or concentration are developed to a certain degree. Other passages use the word atta to refer to oneself as uprooted and injured if one prevents someone from giving alms, or has become pure when one lives virtuously. So such character is clearly changeable, not a permanent self-essence. As it changes, it is impermanent, and so must be anattā, non-self. Atta can also be used as equivalent to citta, the mind or perhaps heart-mind. This is evident from Dhammapada verse 160. Self is protector of oneself. For what other protector would there be? For with a well-controlled self, one gains a protector hard to gain. Here the protector self is one which is well-controlled, paralleling another Dhammapada verse that says, a controlled citta, controlled mind, is conducive to happiness. A self or citta identity between self and citta is also seen in two passages. The first refers to perfect application of self as leading to prosperity. The second to a perfectly applied citta as of more benefit than the action of relatives. Now something which must be controlled or well applied is evidently changing, and not an unchanging metaphysical self with a capital S. The protector self is simply the empirical citta, the mind, which is said to be very changeable, so that it should not be seen as myself, my permanent self. Citta, as self, seems to refer to one's psychological or emotional centre, which can be uncontrolled, badly applied or agitated, or well controlled, well applied and calm. It is self in this sense which can criticise one, upbraid one, as can other people for lapses from virtue. It is also a self which can be unguarded, even if a person is protected externally by an army. So these are all kind of acceptable uses of the self. The word self are just the kind of changing mind that one can cultivate, if you like. Quote 5. The non-self teaching does not deny that there is a continuity of character in life, and to some extent from life to life. But persistent character traits are merely due to the repeated occurrence of certain cittas, in the sense of mindsets perhaps. While character traits may be long-lasting, they can and do change, and are thus impermanent, and so non-self, insubstantial. A person, in the discourse of the Buddha, is seen as a collection of rapidly changing and interacting mental and physical processes, with character patterns reoccurring over some time. Only partial control can be exercised over these processes, so that they often change in undesired ways, as anybody who's tried meditation knows. You can't make the mind calm, you can't make the mind concentrate. You can just gently encourage it to be like that. Okay. So these changes in ways you don't like can lead to suffering. Impermanent, they cannot be a permanent self. Being painful, they cannot be an autonomous true I, which would contain nothing that was out of harmony with itself. Just a brief comment on rebirth and non-self. Buddhism sees no need to postulate a permanent self, and it accounts for the functioning of personality in life and from life to life in terms of a stream of changing, conditioned and conditioning processes. Hence it's said that from one life to the next, a being is, quote, neither the same nor different. That is, neither unchangingly the same nor completely different. That's because the kind of later being is kind of causally shaped by the earlier being, but they're not the same as it. Rebirth is not seen as requiring a permanent self or a substantial I, although it is said that belief in such a self, belief in I, is one of the things that drives and causes rebirth. Okay, get now towards quote 6, on enlightening people as having a great self. Spiritually developed people of the ancient world are sometimes referred to in the West as the great souls of antiquity. This idea finds a parallel in the Buddhist term Mahāyāna, which means great self. This does not refer to some pre-existent underlying self with capital S, but simply to the empirical self of a person that has come to be strong in wholesome, skillful qualities. Of the Buddhist path, it is said that this is a path by which those with great selves, great seers, have fared. Such people are said to have a great self, because they are developed in their body of good qualities, in their ethical discipline, mind and wisdom, as it says in one discourse. And it's also said that an arahat, a liberated person, is one of developed self. The term Mahāyāna also resurfaced in recent times in the title Mahatma, Sanskrit, great soul, great self, which applied to Gandhi in Hinduism. Overall, the perspective of the Pali discourses of the Buddha can be summarized as follows on the topic I'm talking about. First of all, in the changing empirical self, no permanent self, no self-essence, no independent self can be found. Yet one of a person's volitional activities is the I am conceit, the gut feeling or attitude that one is or has a real self, a substantial I, substantial me. As a person develops spiritually, their empirical self becomes stronger as they become more centered, calm, aware, open, and together. In this process, awareness of all factors of personality as non-self, empty of an independent permanent self, or anything owned by and controlled by such a thing. So, seeing that nothing is such a self undermines grasping, clinging, craving and attachment, and so makes a person calmer and stronger. At the pinnacle of spiritual development, the liberated person is free of all the causes of dukkha, or pain, and thus lacks any I am conceit, being free from the burden of ego. Till you're enlightened, you've got to cart around this heavy shopping bag of ego. What a drag. Put it down. Okay. Yet, a liberated person is said to have a great empirical self, in the sense of being a kind of spiritually big person. They have a presence, a great calm, very centered, compassionate, and wise. Those who are enlightened ones have not destroyed the self. They have destroyed the I am conceit and the deluded sense of self or I. And I've directly known that they always were composed of non-self processes. Just spotted a typo which shows I do not have full control of my perception and typing. Both of these are not so. Anyway, they know they always were composed of not-self process. They do not attain no self, but attain insight into all as non-self. It is not that they know that things are not the self, as the use of the word the already posits a self that supposedly exists. So sensitivity to these above nuances should help one avoid incoherent talk relating to the non-self teaching. Small thing on Nirvana as non-self. Again, quote 2 is relevant here. While Nirvana, the Buddhist goal, or certainly goal of early Buddhism, while Nirvana, like a supposed self, is beyond impermanence and dukkha, it is still seen as non-self. This is made clear in a recurring passage which says that all sankharas, or conditioned phenomena, conditioned things, all sankharas are impermanent and dukkha, but all dhammas are non-self. Dhamma, or dharma in Sanskrit, is a word with many meanings in Buddhism, but here it refers to any basic component of reality. Most are conditioned, but Nirvana is said to be the unconditioned Dhamma. So it's a Dhamma, it's still non-self. Both conditioned and unconditioned Dhammas are non-self. While Nirvana is beyond change and suffering, like a supposed self, it has nothing in it which could support the feeling of I-ness. But this can only arise with respect to the aggregates or bundles, and it is not even truly valid feeling here, it's argued. Now, I want to finish off with something on Mahayana Buddhism and the idea of the Buddha nature. So is the Buddha nature of Mahayana Buddhism a true self? Self with capital S. Within the Mahayana, the idea of the Buddha nature can play a large role, especially in Chan or Zen. This idea is rooted in the idea of the Tathāgata-garbha found in some Indian Mahayana sutras. Tathāgata-garbha means something like womb or embryo of the one who moves in reality, i.e. a Buddha. The Tathāgata-garbha is equated with emptiness in the sense of being empty of and separate from all defilements, such as greed, hatred and delusion. But it is said to be not empty of or separate from inconceivable Buddha qualities. In the Tathāgata-garbha Sutra, it is affirmed that the Buddha be complete with virtues and not different from myself. It's an emptiness which is itself full of possibilities, resplendent with the qualities of Buddhahood, beginningless, unchanging and permanent, and it's something within us. Okay. This embryo is seen as existing within all living beings, indicating that however deluded or defiled they are, they can mature into Buddhas. The Tathāgata-garbha then represents the kind of Buddha potential within all beings. It is said to have an intrinsic purity of a jewel, space or water, to be brightly shining with lucid clarity, and is by nature brightly shining and pure. Beings are seen as ignorant of this great inner treasure, but the Buddha reveals it to them so as to encourage them in spiritual development. Moreover, it is the Tathāgata-garbha which is said to respond to spiritual teaching and aspire for Nirvana. Now, the idea of brightly shining mind, pabhasara citta or prabhasvara citta, has its root in an early Buddhist idea expressed in a particular Pali discourse, which says, "Monks, this mind is brightly shining, but it is defiled by defilements which arrive." That is, the basic nature of mind is radiant, even though it is often defiled by defilements which kind of visit. I often think of this as a bit like people who come round to your house, get their feet under the table, and then act as if they own the place. Kind of problematic visitors, defilements. Yeah. In the context of the Pali Suttas, this brightly shining mind is seen as a bright potential which is uncovered and experienced when the 5 hindrances, such as sense, desire and ill will, are suspended in the jhanas or meditative absorptions. But it is not seen as an enlightened state. Once found, it has to be worked with and developed. When unobscured by defilements, the brightly shining basic nature of mind can be a basis for the attainment of liberating insight that leads to the experience of nirvana. Otherwise, defilements will in time return, and the various kinds of rebirth will follow. Though some of these could be in the bright heavenly realms where the defilements are at least weak. The Theravāda tradition also does not see the brightly shining mind as permanent. The commentator Buddhaghosa refers to it as the naturally pure, latent resting state of mind. That's bhavanga. This being a mode of mind that is uninterrupted in dreamless sleep, but flicked in and out of in waking consciousness, so it's not there all the time. Now, in the Mahayana, the Lankavatara Sutta describes the Tathāgata-garbha, which is seen as radiant and pure, as hidden in the body of every being like a gem of great value. It is eternal, permanent. This makes it sound rather like a permanent self, with capital S, though the text seems somewhat ambivalent on this. On the one hand, the Dharma body, the fully mature Tathāgata-garbha, is seen as the perfection of permanence and the perfection of self. That's in the Srimala Sutta. On the other hand, while the Tathāgata-garbha may seem like either a self or an eternal creator to the ignorant, Lankavatara says it is not, for it is seen the same as emptiness. It may be self-like, but it is not a true self, in the sense of I. So the Lanka says, the Buddha is neither a self nor the skandhas, the aggregates. He is knowledge free from evil taints. However, there is a Mahayana text, the Mahāyāna Mahaparinibbāna Sutra, which makes some rather bold claims. It says, because beings are overwhelmed by the defilement of ignorance, they develop distorted views. They see what has an essential self as lacking an essential self. They see what is permanent as impermanent. They see what is pure as impure. They see what is pleasurable as painful. What has an essential self refers to the Buddha. What is impermanent refers to the Dharma body. What is permanent refers to the Dharma body. What is pleasurable refers to Nirvana. What is pure refers to the Dharma. Thinking of what lacks an essential self as possessing one, and of what possesses an essential self as lacking one, is to have a distorted view of the Dharma. Samsara lacks an essential self. The Tathāgata possesses an essential self. The disciples and solitary Buddhas are impermanent. The Dharma body of the Tathāgata is permanent. Right, quite an interesting thing. Some of what's said here I wouldn't see as problematic. One could say that Nirvana, or the unconditioned, is permanent, or at least beyond time, beyond any pain or suffering, pure. Where it gets problematic is in the statement there is such a thing as a self, and it's the Buddha. Okay. To me, this kind of view, which is very rare even in Mahayana texts, sutras at least, is a kind of skillful means at most to attract perhaps people to Buddhism who are Hindus, who are very much like the idea of self, who believe in true self. So it's a kind of maybe a skillful means of attracting people towards Buddhism in a certain historical context. In Tibet, there was a debate between those of the self-emptiness, Rangtong, and other emptiness, Shentong perspectives. Perspectives on emptiness, an important concept in the Mahayana. Those of the other emptiness view, as seen, for example, in Dzogchen teachings, see the other empty pure reality as the Tathāgata-garbha, interpreted as a pre-existent, fully enlightened reality that's there already, just needs uncovering. It's a radiance that is empty of defilements. We just need to find it. It's there already. Those of the self-emptiness view, such as the Gelugpas, see talk of the Tathāgata-garbha as simply a way of saying that emptiness of inherent nature of the minds of beings means that they're capable of ultimate change, so that they can become Buddhas. The latter view perhaps downplays the idea of the radiance of mind uncovered in meditation as a specific seed of future Buddhahood, whereas the other emptiness view is contentious in holding that the Tathāgata-garbha does not and need not change, being already present, perfect Buddhahood within. We just need to find it. So just a last comment. In the history of the Buddhist Society, Christmas Humphreys, of course, believed in a true self, with capital S, which perhaps, probably, partly be due to his coming to Buddhism through Theosophy, which had a Hindu component, and also perhaps due to the influence of such texts as the Mahāyāna Mahaparinirvāna Sutra. That's my lot. Okay.